Between March and November of 1848, 7 different families in New Orleans purchased the same girl. Each transaction was documented with meticulous precision by the city's most reputable notaries. Each buyer was among the Creole elite, families whose names appeared in the original French colonial records, and each family, without exception, returned her to the market within 10 days, often selling her at a loss that made no economic sense whatsoever. The New Orleans Bee never reported on this pattern. Neither did the Daily Picayune, but in the ledgers of slave brokers along Chartres Street, in the private correspondence of factors who handled such transactions, in the whispered conversations at the French Opera House, a warning circulated through Louisiana's upper class. Do not purchase the yellow girl who sings. The price you pay will be the least of what she costs you. What could one 16-year-old girl do in 10 days that would make wealthy planters desperate to rid themselves of her? Why would men who'd built fortunes on sugar and cotton choose financial ruin over keeping her another week? And why, when New Orleans police finally investigated in December of that year, did they seal every document related to her case with an order that remains in effect 176 years later? Before we continue with the story of what the newspapers called the Songbird Scandal, make sure you're subscribed to Liturgy of Fear and hit that notification bell. What you're about to hear has been deliberately erased from Louisiana history. Also, drop a comment telling us what state or city you're listening from. We want to know where our community of truth seekers is growing. The girl's name, according to the earlier sale document, was Celeste. No surname, no indication of origin beyond the notation believed to be from Stoang originally. She was described with the clinical precision that characterized such records. Female, approximately 16 years, light mulatto complexion, hazel eyes, height 5 feet 3 inches in, no visible scarring, educated in French and English, accomplished in needlework and music, suitable for domestic service in refined households. What these documents didn't capture, what no written description could convey, was the effect of her appearance. Multiple accounts from those who saw her described something that went beyond conventional beauty into territory that made people uncomfortable. Her features held a symmetry that seemed almost mathematical, as if someone had taken every ideal proportion and assembled them with deliberate precision. Her skin, the color of honey cut with cream, appeared luminous in certain light. Her hair, neither straight nor tightly curled, but somewhere beautifully between, fell in waves that caught sunlight like dark water. But it was her expression that truly unsettled observers. Most enslaved people, especially young women in vulnerable positions, had learned to make their faces blank, to show nothing that might invite unwanted attention or punishment. Celeste's face showed something different, not defiance exactly, but a kind of patient awareness, as if she were watching a play whose ending she already knew, and was simply waiting for the other actors to reach their marks. The first documented sale occurred on March 14, 1848. The buyer was Monsieur Edo Desa, owner of Belle-Rive Plantation, 30 miles upriver from New Orleans. Desaun paid $1,400, a premium price reflecting both Celeste's appearance and her reported accomplishments. The bill of sale was witnessed by 2 notaries and filed properly with the parish recorder. Desaun's wife, Madame Huiz, had specifically requested a lady's maid, someone who could assist with dressing, manage her wardrobe, and provide companionship during the long afternoons when Edouard attended to plantation business. Madame Desaun was a woman of refined tastes, who prided herself on maintaining the standards of French civilization in what she considered the barbarous American wilderness. For the first 3 days, everything proceeded exactly as Madame Desar had hoped. Celeste proved adept at arranging hair in the latest Parisian styles. Her needlework was exquisite. She moved through the household with quiet efficiency, anticipating needs before they were voiced. The other enslaved people in the Deschamps household noted her presence, but reported nothing unusual. She was respectful to them, neither friendly nor cold, simply present. On the 4th evening, Madame Desaun requested that Celeste sing while helping her prepare for bed. This was not an unusual request. Many Creole families enjoyed having enslaved people provide musical entertainment. Celeste complied without hesitation. What emerged from her throat made Madame Deschamps go very still. The song was in French, an old melody from Saint Domingue that Madame Desson vaguely recognized from her childhood. The lyrics spoke of a garden where beautiful things grew, where jasmine bloomed white as bone and oleander flowers held poison in their perfect petals. Celeste's voice was extraordinary, a clear soprano with unusual resonance that seemed to fill the room and linger in corners even after the notes ended. But there was something else in the singing, something Madame Desson couldn't quite identify. The melody was correct, the pitch perfect, yet listening to it produced a sensation like standing at the edge of a great height, that vertiginous moment before falling, when the body understands danger, but hasn't yet moved to safety. Madame Desard dismissed Celeste for the evening and sat alone in her bedroom for a long time, feeling inexplicably troubled. She couldn't articulate what had disturbed her about the song. The lyrics were innocuous enough, the voice was beautiful, yet she found herself unable to shake a feeling of profound unease, as if the singing had revealed something she'd been trying not to see. That night, Madame de Samp didn't sleep well. When she did drift off, she dreamed of her childhood in Saint Domingue before the Revolution, before her family had fled to Louisiana with whatever wealth they could salvage. In the dream, she walked through her family's plantation house, but the rooms were empty. The furniture, the paintings, the silver, everything that had made them who they were had vanished. She woke at dawn with tears on her face for reasons she couldn't explain. The next evening, despite an instinct that warned her against it, Madame Desson asked Celeste to sing again. This time, the song was different. A lullaby that Haitian mothers sang to their children. The French lyrics spoke of sleep and safety, of a mother's protection against the dangers of the night. Celeste sang it while brushing Madame de Samp's hair, her voice soft and intimate. Madame Desson found herself crying, without understanding why. The song was beautiful, the sentiment tender, yet listening to it opened something inside her, some carefully sealed chamber where she'd locked away feelings she couldn't afford to acknowledge. She thought of the enslaved women at Belle Rive, who had children, how those children could be sold away at any moment if Edouard decided it was economically advantageous. She thought of her own role in maintaining a system that treated human beings as property. She thought of the stories her mother had told about Saint Domingue, about what had driven the enslaved to revolution, and she felt a shame so intense it was almost physical. "Stop," Madame Deschamps said, her voice shaking. "Stop singing." Celeste stopped immediately, her face showing nothing, waiting for further instruction. "Leave me," Madame Deschamps said. "Go to your quarters. Don't sing any more." By the 7th day, Madame Desson could no longer bear Celeste's presence in the house. She couldn't explain it to her husband. How could she tell him that a 16-year-old enslaved girl had somehow made her see their entire life clearly, had stripped away every comfortable justification, every assurance that they were benevolent owners who treated their property with Christian kindness? How could she explain that Celeste's singing had revealed the hollowest of those claims, had made her understand with terrible clarity that no amount of kindness could redeem the fundamental wrong of owning another human being? On the 8th day, Edouard Desson brought Celeste back to New Orleans and sold her to a cotton factor named Armand Thibodeau for $1,200, a $200 loss. When Thibodeau asked if there was any defect in the gear, Deschamps' response was noted in the sale document. "No physical defect. My wife found her unsuitable for household service." Thibodeau was a practical man who saw an opportunity in Desson's apparent irrationality. He'd purchased a beautiful, educated, accomplished young woman for below market value. His wife, Marguerite, had been wanting a lady's maid for months. This seemed like a fortunate transaction. The pattern repeated with mechanical precision. Marguerite Thibault was initially delighted with Celeste. The girl was everything promised, skilled, attentive, refined. On the 4th evening, Marguerite asked her to sing while mending a torn lace collar. Celeste sang a song about the sea, about waves that returned again and again to shore, no matter what stood in their way. The metaphor was so subtle that Marguerite didn't consciously recognize it, but something in her mind understood, and that understanding began working on her like acid on metal, slowly dissolving the structures that had supported her worldview. By the 9th day, Marguerite Thibodeau was having nightmares. She dreamed of drowning, of being held underwater by hands she couldn't see. She woke gasping and found herself unable to look Celeste in the eyes. The girl's hazel gaze, patient and knowing, made Marguerite feel transparent, as if every rationalization she'd ever constructed, every comfortable lie she'd told herself about the natural order of things, was visible and worthless. Armand Thibodeau sold Celeste on the 10th day to a sugar plantation owner named Christophe Beauregard for $1,000, a transaction that cost him $200 plus the notary fees. When his business partner asked why he'd sold at a loss after less than 2 weeks, Thibodeau's response was my wife's nerves couldn't tolerate the girl's presence. By June, Celeste had been sold 4 times. The losses to her various owners now totaled $600, not including transaction costs. More significantly, a pattern had emerged that the city's slave brokers couldn't ignore. Every family that purchased her returned her within 10 days. Every sale involved a financial loss, and every owner, when pressed, used variations of the same vague explanation. Unsuitable for household service, wife's nerves couldn't tolerate, created domestic disharmony. The brokers began comparing notes. They discovered that Celeste had done nothing objectionable in any household. No stealing, no insubordination, no laziness, no attempts to run away. She was, by all objective measures, an ideal domestic servant. Yet her presence in these elegant Creole homes produced effects that made wealthy families desperate to be rid of her, regardless of financial cost. One broker, a man named Lucien Préjean, who handled many of the city's most expensive slave transactions, decided to investigate. He interviewed 4 of the families who'd owned Celeste, conducting the conversations with the discretion that his position required. What he learned troubled him enough that he stopped handling any sales involving her. Préjean's notes, discovered decades later in his estate papers, reveal a man trying to understand something that defied rational explanation. Each family reports that the girl performed her duties without fault, he wrote. Yet each family experienced what they describe as domestic disturbances, nightmares, feelings of unease and guilt, arguments between husband and wife, a general fear of discomfort that intensified each day the girl remained in the household. Most troubling is the consistent report that these disturbances began after the girl sang. Multiple families mentioned her singing specifically, describing it as beautiful yet deeply disturbing in ways they cannot articulate. Préjean attempted to observe Celeste himself. He visited her at the slave pen where she was held between sales and requested that she sing. What he heard made him close his investigation immediately and refuse all future involvement with her case. In a private letter to his brother, Préjean described the experience. She sang a simple song, something about birds flying home. Her voice is indeed extraordinary, technically flawless, with a quality that reaches past the ear directly into the chest. But there is something else in it, brother. Something I lack the words to explain. As she sang, I found myself thinking of our mother, of how she wept the night father sold Marie Claire and her children to settle a gambling debt. I remembered how mother couldn't look at us for days after, how she stopped going to church, how she died within the year, and everyone said it was yellow fever. But I knew better. I knew she died of shame. And as this yellow girl sang her simple song about birds, I understood for the first time that our mother's shame was earned, that we all earned it, and that Marie Claire's children are somewhere in Texas or Mississippi, bearing our sin while we prosper from it. I left that slave pen shaking and have not been able to eat properly since. By July, Celeste had become unmarketable through conventional channels. The auction houses refused to accept her. Privat dealers who'd handled previous sales declined involvement. Word had spread through New Orleans' tight-knit Creole community. The beautiful yellow girl who sings will destroy your household's peace. Stay away. This should have been the end of it. An unsellable slave would typically be sent to the agricultural interior, sold cheaply to small farmers who couldn't afford premium prices, or put to brutal plantation labor where domestic sensibilities didn't matter. But Celeste's case had attracted attention from someone who saw opportunity in what others feared. His name was Matthew Laval, and unlike the Creole families who'd owned Celeste briefly, he wasn't interested in her as a domestic servant. Laval collected beautiful things, rare things, things that other men couldn't or wouldn't possess. He owned the city's finest private art collection, He kept exotic birds from South America in an aviary behind his Garden District mansion. He was known for acquiring items at bargain prices when panic or superstition drove down their value, then displaying them as trophies of his superior rationality. When Laval learned that a beautiful, educated, accomplished enslaved girl was being sold for a fraction of her actual value because of vague reports about singing and nightmares, he saw exactly what he'd been looking for, something extraordinary that fear had made cheap. On August 3rd, Matthew Laval purchased Celeste for $700, half her original sale price. The broker who handled the transaction, a man desperate enough for commission to ignore the warnings, made Laval sign a document acknowledging that he'd been informed of previous owners' complaints. Laval signed without hesitation, his signature bold and confident. As he took possession of Celeste and led her to his carriage, he spoke to her for the first time. "I understand you sing," he said in French. "Good. I'm hosting a dinner party in 3 days. You'll perform for my guests. I expect you to demonstrate why you're worth $700 instead of the $200 you'll likely fetch when I tire of you." Celeste said nothing. She simply looked at him with those patient hazel eyes, and Matthew Laval felt something he rarely experienced, a flicker of uncertainty quickly suppressed, but present nonetheless. The dinner party would take place on August 6th. What happened that evening would force New Orleans authorities to take official action, would create documents that remain sealed to this day, and would ensure that Celeste's story, like so many stories of enslaved resistance, would be deliberately erased from history. But the true secret of what Celeste was doing, the impossible mechanism behind her effect on New Orleans' elite families, was something far more sophisticated than anyone suspected. And understanding it requires knowing not just what happened in those elegant parlors when she sang, but what had happened to her long before she ever arrived in Louisiana. Matthew Laval's Garden District mansion occupied an entire city block on Britannia Street, 3 stories of white-painted brick, galleries wrapped with wrought iron imported from France, gardens that had taken 2 decades to cultivate into the appearance of wild elegance. The house announced wealth, taste, and the kind of cultural refinement that separated New Orleans' elite from what they considered the crude American merchants flooding into the city. Laval had invited 20 guests to his August 6th dinner party, carefully selected from families whose names appeared in the original colonial records. The Maragnes, the D'Antalbas, the Valeris. These were people who understood that in New Orleans, bloodline and culture mattered more than mere money. They spoke French by preference, attended the opera, maintained the standards that made them Creole rather than simply residents of Louisiana. The dining room glittered with crystal and silver. Laval's chef had prepared a 7-course meal featuring ingredients shipped from France, oysters from the Gulf, and game from the surrounding wetlands. Conversation flowed in that peculiar mixture of French and English that characterized New Orleans society, touching on politics, the opera season, the latest gossip from Paris. After the 4th course, Laval stood and tapped his wine glass with a knife, calling for attention. "My friends," he said in French, "I have acquired something remarkable, a young woman of extraordinary accomplishment who will provide our evening's entertainment. I present to you the singer who has been the subject of so much ridiculous speculation in recent months." He gestured toward the doorway, where Celeste stood waiting. She wore a simple dress of pale blue cotton, her hair arranged in the Creole style with a tiny headscarf that Louisiana law required free women of color to wear. Though the law was often ignored for enslaved domestic servants in white households, against the opulence of the room, she appeared almost ethereal, a figure from a painting who'd somehow stepped into reality. Several guests recognized her immediately. Whispers circulated, "That's the girl, the one from T. He Desson household. I heard Marguerite Thibodeau had nightmares for weeks." Madame d'Antalba leaned toward her husband and said quietly, "Matthew is a fool. He thinks his rational mind makes him immune to whatever troubled the others." Laval, interpreting the whispers as validation of his boldness, smiled. "I've asked Celeste to sing for us. She comes highly recommended, though at a price that suggests other buyers lacked my discernment. Celeste, please begin." Celeste stepped into the center of the room. She looked at the assembled guests, 20 of New Orleans' wealthiest and most powerful families, and something flickered in her hazel eyes. Not defiance, not fear, recognition perhaps, as if she'd seen this exact scene before, and knew precisely how it would unfold. She began to sing. The song was in Creole French, an old melody that several of the older guests vaguely recognized but couldn't quite place. The lyrics spoke of a great house on a hill, of gardens filled with flowers, of children playing in sunshine while their mothers watched, from shadowed doorways, beautiful images, pastoral and peaceful. But as Celeste's voice filled the room, something began to happen. Madame Margny, seated near the head of the table, found herself thinking of a woman named Francois, who nursed her as an infant in Saint Domingue. Francois had been enslaved by Madame Marini's family, had fed her from her own breast while her own child went hungry. Madame Marini hadn't thought of Francois in 40 years. She'd never known what happened to her after the revolution, whether she'd escaped, been killed, found freedom. She realized with sudden horror that she'd never cared enough to ask. Monsieur de Pontal, Ba was remembering a man named Jacques, who taught him to ride when he was a boy. Jacques had been patient, gentle, had protected him from a bad fall once by putting his own body between the boy and the ground. Diontalba's father had sold Jacques when Diontalba was 8, had sold him to a cotton plantation in Mississippi, where the mortality rate was notoriously high. Diontalba had cried for a week, then forgotten until now, until Celeste's voice somehow reached into memory and pulled Jacques back into unbearable clarity. The song continued. Celeste's voice remained technically perfect. Not a note wavered, not a pitch missed. Yet what she was doing went far beyond simple singing. Each phrase seemed to open doors in the listeners' minds, doors to rooms they'd locked and forgotten, where all the people they'd owned and lost waited in patient silence. Laval himself felt something shifting inside him, some carefully constructed wall beginning to crack. He'd always told himself that his art collection, his cultural refinement, his devotion to beauty somehow elevated him above the crude commerce of slavery. He patronized the arts. He spoke French. He appreciated music. Surely that made him different from the plantation owners who worked people to death in cane fields. But as Celeste sang, he found himself unable to maintain that distinction. The beautiful things he owned, the mansion, the art, the exotic birds in their gilded cage, all of it had been purchased with money derived from suffering. The very room where he sat, displaying his cultural superiority, had been built by enslaved craftsmen. The food he served came from fields worked by people he'd never meet, whose names he'd never know, whose pain had been converted into his pleasure with such efficiency that he'd never had to witness the conversion directly. The song ended for perhaps 10 seconds. Absolute silence filled the dining room. Then Madame Valérie stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I'm not feeling well," she said, her voice unsteady. "Charles, we must leave." Her husband, still pale from his own memories, nodded and helped her toward the door. Within minutes, 3 other families had made similar excuses and departed. The carefully orchestrated dinner party dissolved into chaos as guests fled, their faces showing a range of emotions from confusion to something approaching terror. Laval stood frozen, watching his social triumph collapse. Only 5 guests remained, too polite to leave immediately but clearly uncomfortable. Celeste stood in the center of the room, exactly where she'd been when singing, her expression unchanged, patient and knowing. "Get out," Laval said to her quietly. "Go to the quarters now." Celeste left without a word. The remaining guests departed within the hour, making thin excuses. Laval's servants cleaned the table in silence while he sat in his study drinking brandy and trying to understand what had happened. The next morning, Laval did something unprecedented in his career as a collector. He took Celeste directly to the slave pen on Bond Street and told the broker he wanted her sold immediately. "I don't care about the price," Laval said. "Find someone who will take her today. I'll accept any reasonable offer." The broker, a man named Duplexis, who'd handled several of Celestia's previous sales, shook his head. "Mimsy Laval, I cannot. Every dealer in the city knows about her now. After what happened at your dinner party, the talk is everywhere. No one will purchase her. Then sell her to someone outside the city. Send her to the country, to the plantations. Someone must need domestic labor." Duplessis hesitated. "There is one possibility. A Madame Corbeau has been asking about unusual acquisitions. She runs a very particular kind of establishment. What kind? The kind that caters to gentlemen with specific tastes. She collects beautiful women of color. With your permission, I could approach her. Laval felt a wave of disgust, though whether at Duplexis's suggestion or at his own willingness to consider it, he couldn't say. How much would she pay for a girl this beautiful despite the complications? Perhaps 400. Maybe 5 if I negotiate well. 400 represented nearly a 50% loss from what he'd paid. But Laval found he didn't care. He needed Celeste gone. He needed to stop seeing that patient, knowing expression in his mind every time he closed his eyes. Do it, he said today. Duplexis negotiated skillfully. Madame Corbeau paid $450 for Celeste that afternoon, making Laval's total loss $250 in just 3 days of ownership. But Madame Corbeau's establishment presented a different kind of problem, and it was there, in the elegant bordello on Rampart Street, that catered to New Orleans' wealthiest men, that Celeste's case would finally attract official attention. The investigation began not with police or magistrates, but with a music teacher named Émile Gravois. Gravois was an unusual figure in New Orleans society. Born in France, trained at the Paris Conservatory, he'd come to Louisiana in 1842 to escape gambling debts and a failing marriage. He made his living teaching piano and voice to the daughters of wealthy families, work that paid adequately if not generously, and allowed him to maintain a small apartment in the Versailles Carré. But Gravois's real passion was the study of music's psychological effects. He'd read everything available on the subject, from ancient Greek theories about musical modes affecting temperament to more recent work by German scholars on the relationship between melody and emotion. He believed that music operated on the human mind through mechanisms that could be studied and understood scientifically. When rumors reached Gravois about an enslaved girl whose singing drove wealthy families to irrational behavior, his professional curiosity was aroused. He began asking questions, collecting accounts, trying to understand what was actually happening. In late August, Gravois managed to gain entry to Madame Corbeau's establishment by claiming to be evaluating potential musical entertainment for a wealthy client. Madame Corbeau, always interested in attracting upscale clientele, granted him a brief interview with Celeste. They met in a small parlor on the second floor. Celeste sat in a chair by the window, afternoon light making her skin luminous. She looked at Gravois with those hazel eyes and waited. "I'm a music teacher," Gravois said in French. "I've heard remarkable things about your singing. Would you be willing to perform for me?" For the first time since the documentary record of her began, Celeste spoke more than a simple yes or no. "Why?" she asked. Her voice was cultured, educated, with an accent that Gravois couldn't quite place. "Because I want to understand what you're doing. And if you understand what, then will you stop me?" Gravois considered the question. "I don't know. Perhaps I simply want to know if what you're doing is what I think you're doing." "What do you think I'm doing?" "You're using specific songs to trigger specific memories in your listeners. Songs from do songs that Creole families would have heard in their childhoods before the Revolution. You're not just singing beautifully. You're deliberately accessing their buried memories of enslaved people they once knew, people they cared about, perhaps people who disappeared during the Revolution or were sold away or killed. And you're making them remember with such clarity that they can't maintain the psychological distance that allows them to own other human beings." Celeste smiled for the first time in any recorded account. It was a small smile, but genuine. "You're very perceptive, Miss Gravois. How did you learn to do this? Who taught you?" "My grandmother in Stong before I was born. She was what the whites called a griot, a keeper of songs, of stories, of histories that couldn't be written down. She understood that music carries memory, that certain melodies unlock doors in the mind that words alone can't open. She taught my mother. My mother taught me before she died. And the songs you choose are specific to each family. I listen to them talk. I learn their histories, where they came from in Saint Domingue, which plantations their families owned, who they lost in the Revolution. Then I choose songs that will remind them of those specific losses, those specific people. The songs themselves aren't magic. They're just keys to locks that these families built inside themselves." Gravois leaned forward. "But why? What do you hope to accomplish? You're being sold and resold, losing value with each transaction. This can't end well for you." Celestia looked out the window at the street below, in Saint Domingue. My mother told me the enslaved sometimes killed themselves rather than be worked to death. They called it flying home, returning to Africa through death. But my grandmother taught a different kind of resistance. She said the revolution happened not just because of violence, but because enough enslaved people stopped pretending, stopped acting the part of happy servants, stopped helping whites convince themselves that slavery was natural and right. When enough people refused to pretend, the whole structure became impossible to maintain. And you think you can do that here in Louisiana? One girl. I think I can make a few families see truly, and those families will talk to other families, and maybe eventually enough white people will be unable to maintain their comfortable lives. I don't expect to see it happen. I expect to die here in this city, probably young, but I can plant seeds. That's resistance too. Gravois sat back, genuinely shaken. He'd expected to find trickery, some exploitable technique, perhaps even fraud. Instead, he'd found something far more sophisticated and far more dangerous. A young woman who turned music into a weapon against psychological oppression, who understood her enslavers better than they understood themselves. I should warn you, he said quietly. This cannot end safely for you. When they understand what you're doing, when they stop being confused and start being angry, you'll be in grave danger. I know. Then why continue? Because I've already seen 15 families unable to maintain their certainty. 15 households where the comfortable lies cracked. Some of those people will change. Not all, maybe not even most, but some will. And their change will affect others. This is how systems fall, Monsieur Gravois. Not all at once, but through thousands of small cracks that eventually bring down the whole structure. Before Gravois could respond, Madame Corbeau entered the parlor. Monsieur, your time is finished. If your client is interested in Celeste services, we can discuss terms. Otherwise, I must ask you to leave. Gravois left, his mind churning. That evening he sat in his apartment and wrote a detailed account of his conversation with Celeste. He intended it as a private record, but the document would later be discovered among his papers and would provide one of the only first-hand accounts of Celeste's own explanation of her methods. What Gravois didn't know, what no one could have predicted, was that Celeste's time in Madame Corbeau's establishment would lead directly to the intervention that would seal all official records of her case. Because 3 nights after Gravois' visit, one of Madame Corbeau's regular clients requested Celeste's presence at a private gathering. The client was a man of significant political power, whose name appeared in the highest circles of Louisiana government. What happened at that gathering would force authorities to acknowledge officially what they'd been trying to ignore. That somewhere in their city, an enslaved girl had discovered how to weaponize memory itself, and the damage she was causing to the psychological foundations of slavery couldn't be allowed to continue. The man who requested Celeste's presence at his private gathering was Judge Philippe Dufresne, Associate Justice of the Louisiana Supreme Court. At 53, Dufresne represented the pinnacle of Creole legal authority. His family had held judicial positions since the colonial period. His grandfather had helped draft Louisiana's first state constitution. His decisions shaped slavery law throughout the South. On August 10, 1848, Judge Dufresne hosted a dinner at his Esplanade Avenue residence for 8 carefully selected guests. All were men of significant power. Politicians, plantation owners, a bank president. The stated purpose was to discuss the upcoming gubernatorial election. The actual purpose, understood by all attendees, was to conduct business that required absolute discretion. Madame Corbeau delivered Celeste to the residence at 7 that evening, with instructions that she was to provide musical entertainment, and nothing more. The Madame had been paid handsomely for this arrangement, and had emphasized to Celeste the importance of pleasing Judge Dufresne. "These are not men to be trifled with," she'd said. "You will sing beautifully and behave impeccably. Do you understand?" Celeste had simply nodded, that patient expression never changing. The men gathered in Drain's library, a room lined with leather-bound legal texts and furnished with the kind of understated elegance that announced old wealth. They smoked cigars, drank brandy from crystal decanters, discussed politics in the careful language of men who wielded power and knew its weight. Judge Dufresne introduced Celeste with calculated nonchalance. "Gentlemen, I've acquired the services of the young woman whose reputation has been circulating through our society. I thought we might test whether the rumors have any foundation or are merely the hysteria of nervous women." Several men laughed. One, a cotton planter named Auguste Fourier, said, "I heard Matthew Lavall's dinner party collapsed in chaos. Half his guests fled in tears." "Laval lacks intellectual rigor," Dufresne replied. "He collects art but doesn't understand it. Beauty unsettles him because he doesn't truly comprehend it." "We are men of more substantial constitution," the others murmured. Agreement. They were rational men, educated men. They'd built their positions through careful thought and strategic action. A 16-year-old enslaved girl who sang couldn't possibly threaten them. Drain gestured to Celeste. "Please sing for us. Something appropriate to the evening." Celestia looked at the 8 men arranged in their comfortable chairs, glasses of expensive brandy in their hands, secure in their power and their certainty. She chose her song with perfect deliberation. It was a judicial ballad from Saint Domingue sung in Creole French. The lyrics told of a judge who presided over trials where enslaved people testified against their masters for crimes committed. In the song, the judge listened carefully to each testimony, documented every cruelty, every violation, every act that the law supposedly forbade but routinely ignored. And at the end of each trial, the judge looked at the assembled witnesses and asked a single question. If law does not protect the powerless from the powerful, what is law but organized violence? The melody was haunting, built on minor keys that created a sense of inevitability, of judgment that couldn't be escaped or appealed. As Celeste sang, Judge Philip Dufresne felt something he hadn't experienced since his first year practicing law. The sensation of being on the wrong side of justice, of having constructed elaborate arguments that served power rather than truth, of having written decisions that protected property rights over human rights because the law, as he interpreted it, demanded such protection. He thought of a case from 1842. An enslaved man had sued for freedom based on documents showing he'd been born free in Cuba. The documents were authentic, the case clear, but Dufresne had ruled against him on a technicality, citing a procedural error in how the petition had been filed. The man had been returned to his owner and subsequently sold to a cotton plantation in Texas. DUI had never learned what happened to him after that, had never cared to inquire. The song continued each verse another question. If justice is blind but only to certain faces, is it justice? If law protects the powerful from consequences, is it law? If courts exist to maintain order rather than righteousness, what separates them from tyranny? Auguste Fourier was remembering a man named Benjamin who'd worked in his household for 15 years. Benjamin had been educated, spoke 4 languages, had helped manage Fort's international shipping arrangements. One night, Benjamin had appeared at Fort's study door with a proposal. He'd saved money over the years, had calculated his own market value, wanted to purchase his freedom and that of his wife and 2 children. He'd presented the offer respectfully with detailed accounting. Fourier had sold all 4 of them to a Mississippi plantation the next day. The presumption, the audacity of an enslaved man thinking he could negotiate terms had infuriated him. He'd wanted Benjamin to understand his place, to grasp that no amount of intelligence or usefulness could change the fundamental reality of ownership. Now listening to Celeste's song, Fourier saw that moment differently, saw his own fear beneath the anger, his fear that if one enslaved person could negotiate freedom, others would try. His fear that acknowledging Benjamin's humanity would force him to acknowledge all their humanity. His fear that the whole system depended on a lie so fragile that one act of recognition could shatter it. The other men in the room were having their own revelations, their own memories surfacing with unbearable clarity. A daughter sold away from her mother to settle a debt. A man beaten to death for a minor infraction because showing weakness would undermine authority. Children separated from families because keeping them together was economically inefficient. The song ended. Celestia stood perfectly still, waiting. Judge Drain rose from his chair slowly, his face ashen. "Get her out of here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Now get her out." The servant who'd been waiting in the hallway hurried forward and escorted Celeste from the library. Behind her she left 8 of Louisiana's most powerful men sitting in silence, their certainty shattered, their comfortable rationalizations exposed as the lies they'd always been. One man, a legislator named Jean-Claude Navarre, stood abruptly and vomited into an ornamental vase. Another, the bank president, was weeping quietly. Fourier sat motionless, staring at nothing. Judge Drain poured himself another brandy with shaking hands. Then he ID something none of the others expected. He called for his clerk and dictated an order. Tomorrow morning, the New Orleans police were to take Celeste into custody. She was to be questioned regarding suspected activities against public order. All documents related to her case were to be sealed pending investigation. The men who'd gathered in that library dispersed within the hour, each returning to his home to wrestle privately with what Celeste had forced them to see. But Judge Duffra's order had set in motion something that couldn't be stopped. The next morning, 2 city constables arrived at Madame Corbeau's establishment, with instructions to take Celeste into custody. Madame Corbeau protested vigorously. "The girl is my legal property. I have documentation. You cannot simply remove her without cause." The senior constable, a man named Broussard, handed her the orders signed by Judge Drain. "We're acting on judicial authority. The girl will be held for questioning. If the investigation finds no wrongdoing, she'll be returned to you." Celeste was taken to the Cabo, the building that housed city government and the jail. She was placed in a small room, not quite a cell, with a table and 2 chairs. She waited there for 3 hours before the door opened, and a man entered who would prove crucial to understanding what happened next. Captain Etienne Marchand was chief investigator for the New Orleans police. At 41, he'd handled every kind of case the city could produce, from petty theft to murder, from smuggling to political corruption. He prided himself on his ability to find truth, regardless of how deeply it was buried. But he'd never investigated an enslaved person accused of no specify crime beyond making wealthy white families uncomfortable. Marchand sat across from Celeste and studied her for a long moment. She met his gaze calmly, those hazel eyes showing the same patient awareness that had unsettled so many others. "Your name is Celeste," Marchand said in French. "That's the name I was given when I was sold. My real name is Adelaide." "Where were you born, Adelaide?" "Port-au-Prince, Saint-Domingue, before it became Haiti. That would make you approximately 16 now. You would have been born after the Revolution. My mother escaped to Jamaica during the Revolution. I was born there. She died when I was 7. My grandmother raised me until I was 13. Then she died too. I was alone, orphaned, vulnerable. A man saw opportunity in that. He forged papers claiming I'd been born enslaved, sold me to a slave trader heading for New Orleans. I arrived here 2 years ago." Marchand made notes on paper in front of him. "You speak remarkable French for someone supposedly enslaved from birth. My grandmother believed education was resistance. She taught me French, English, mathematics, history. She taught me the songs of Saint Domingue, the old stories. She said knowledge was the one thing they couldn't steal from you. And the singing, the effect it has on those who hear you." Adelaide smiled slightly. "What effect do you mean, Captain?" "I sing beautifully. Some people find beauty disturbing. Multiple families have sold you at significant financial loss. Multiple witnesses report nightmares, feelings of guilt, household disruptions. Judge Dufresne himself ordered your detention because of what happened in his library last night. Don't insult my intelligence by claiming you don't understand what you're doing." Adelaide leaned forward. "I understand perfectly what I'm doing. The question is, do you understand what they're doing? These families who purchase human beings as property, who separate mothers from children, who build fortunes on suffering, who create elaborate philosophical and legal justifications for evil. I don't cause their guilt, Captain. I simply make it visible their guilt was always there. They just worked very hard not to see it, by deliberately choosing songs that trigger specific memories, by helping them remember their own humanity, and the humanity of people they've tried very hard to forget." Marchand set down his pen. "Off the record, Adelaide, what do you think will happen now? You've disturbed some of the most powerful men in Louisiana. Judge Dufresne, Auguste Fourier, these are not men who accept disruption to their certainty. They will find a way to neutralize you. I know, and yet you continue. Because neutralizing me doesn't undo what I've done. 15 families can never completely forget what they saw when I sang. Some of them will change. Maybe not publicly, maybe not in ways that seem significant, but they'll change. They'll treat the people they own slightly differently. They'll hesitate before separating families. They'll feel shame when they shouldn't. And that shame will spread. Not like a revolution, not like the violence in Saint Domingue, but like water seeping through stone slowly, invisibly, until one day the stone cracks. You're willing to die for that possibility. My grandmother told me that death comes for everyone. The only choice we have is what we do with the time before it arrives. She chose to preserve songs, to teach resistance. My mother chose to protect me as long as she could. I choose to make comfortable lies uncomfortable. If that cost me my life, at least I used it for something. Marchand was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked a question that wasn't in his official notes. Do you know what happened to your family's plantation in Saint Domingue? Your grandmother's masters? Adelaide's expression shifted, showing real emotion for the first time. They died during the revolution, killed by the people they'd enslaved. My grandmother didn't participate in the killing, but she didn't mourn them either. She said they'd chosen their fate when they chose to own other people. Everything that followed was simply consequence. And you think the same consequence awaits these families here? I think consequence comes in many forms. Sometimes it's violence. Sometimes it's simply the inability to sleep peacefully anymore. Sometimes it's children who grow up questioning what their parents believed. The families I've sung for will carry what I showed them for the rest of their lives. That's consequence too. Marchand closed his notebook. I need to ask you something directly, and I need your honest answer. Are you planning violence? Are you part of any conspiracy to harm these families beyond the psychological disturbance you're causing? No. Violence would be easier to dismiss. They could respond with more violence. But what I'm doing can't be fought with weapons or laws. You can't legislate away memory. You can't hang guilt on a gallows. The only way to stop what I'm doing is to stop owning people. And they won't do that. So they'll try to silence me instead. That afternoon, Marchand submitted his report to Judge Duran. It was careful, professional, deliberately vague about what he'd actually discovered. The subject exhibits no signs of planning violence or property destruction. She has committed no crimes under Louisiana law. Her singing, while apparently disturbing to some listeners, cannot be prohibited without clear evidence of intent to cause harm. Without specific charges, I recommend her return to her legal owner. Judge Dufresne read the report in his chambers. Then he burned it in the fireplace. That evening, Duane convened an emergency meeting with Auguste Fourier, Jean-Claude Navarre, and 3 other men who'd been present at the library gathering. They met in a private room at the Street, Louis Hotel, away from their homes, away from anyone who might overhear. The girl cannot be allowed to continue, Duane said without preamble. Marchand's investigation found nothing actionable, which means the law provides no remedy. We must find another solution. You mean kill her, Fourier said bluntly. I mean neutralize the threat she represents. How that occurs is a practical matter. She's done nothing illegal, Navarre protested. She's sung songs. How can we justify? We justify it by recognizing what she actually is, Dufresne interrupted. She's not simply singing. She's conducting psychological warfare against the foundation of our society. She's discovered a method to undermine the certainty that makes slavery possible. If word spreads that one enslaved girl can systematically destroy the peace of mind of Louisiana's elite families, others will try to replicate her methods. We cannot allow that precedent. The men discussed options. Selling Adelaide out of state was proposed but rejected. Her reputation had spread too far. No one would purchase her without understanding what they were buying. Returning her to Madame Corbeau's establishment was also rejected. She'd have access to more powerful men, more opportunities to cause damage. What emerged from that meeting was a plan that satisfied no one completely, but seemed the only viable option. Adelaide would be purchased from Madame Corbeau at full value, eliminating the financial loss that had characterized previous sales. She would be transported to a remote sugar plantation owned by a man who owed Dufresne substantial favors. There she would work in the fields far from New Orleans society, unable to access the families whose certainty she threatened. And if she attempts to sing, Fourier asked, the plantation owner will be instructed to take appropriate measures to ensure silence. The meaning was clear. If Adele tried to use her voice as weapon, her voice would be taken from her permanently. On August 15th, the arrangements were completed. Madame Corbeau sold Adelaide to an anonymous buyer for $600, accepting the offer because Judge Durain personally guaranteed the transaction. Adelaide was told she was being transferred to a plantation upriver, where her skills would be better utilized. Captain Morand learned of the plan through sources he'd cultivated within the Cabo. He went immediately to the room where Adelaide was being held. "They're sending you to a place where you can't sing anymore," he told her quietly. "A place where your voice will be silenced one way or another. You understand what I'm telling you?" Adelaide nodded. "I understand. I may be able to help. I know people, free people of color, who operate Netu RKS. They move people north to free states, sometimes to Canada. It's dangerous, but it's an option. Why would you help me? Because in 30 years of investigating crimes, I've never encountered someone guilty of nothing except making people see truth. And because Martian paused, searching for words, because after our conversation yesterday, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about a woman named Marie who worked in my family's household when I was a boy. She was kind to me, taught me to read before I went to school. My father sold her when I was 10 to pay a gambling debt. I never knew what happened to her. Never asked, just accepted her disappearance the way I'd accept furniture being moved from one room to another. You made me remember that. You made me see what I'd chosen not to see, and I find I can't forget it now." Adele looked at him with those patient hazel eyes. "Then you understand why I had to do this. Why silence, even survival, matters less than making people remember. I understand, but understanding doesn't mean I want to watch you destroyed. Will you accept help if I can arrange it?" Before Adelaide could answer, the door opened. 2 constables entered with instructions to transport her to the levee where a steamboat waited. Marchand stepped back. He'd offered help, but the offer had come too late. Or perhaps he thought as he watched Adelaide walk calmly between the constables, she'd never intended to accept it. Perhaps being silenced was part of her plan. Another form of testimony that would echo through New Orleans society long after her voice was gone. What Marchand didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Adelaide had set one final plan in motion, a plan that would ensure her story spread far beyond the families she'd personally disturbed. A plan that would turn her silencing into the loudest statement she could possibly make. The steamboat departed New Orleans at dusk on August 16th, carrying a deed up river toward a plantation where her voice would be taken from her forever. But by the time the boat reached its destination 2 days later, events in New Orleans had already begun unfolding that would force authorities to seal every document related to her case and ensure that her story, like so many stories of enslaved resistance, would be deliberately erased from official history. What had she done? What final act of resistance had she prepared that would make her silence speak louder than her songs ever had? The steamboat Belle Creole made slow progress against the Mississippi's current, stopping at plantations along the river to load sugar and cotton. Adelaide was kept in a small cabin near the cargo hold, guarded but not chained. The captain had been paid well to ensure her safe delivery to Magnolia Grove Plantation, where arrangements had been made for her permanent silencing. What no one aboard the Belle Creole knew was that Adelaide had spent her final week in New Orleans doing far more than waiting for her fate. The truth emerged 3 days after her departure when a plantation owner named Victor Dumars came to the Cabildo in a state of barely controlled panic. Dumars owned a modest sugar operation 20 miles upriver with 32 enslaved workers. He was not part of New Orleans' elite social circles, had never attended dinners at Judge Douay's residence, had never heard of Celeste Adelaide. But on the evening of August 18th, something happened and his fields that made him understand why powerful men were willing to bend every rule to silence one 16-year-old girl. As the sun set and the work horn sounded the end of the day, the women in Dumas fields began to sing. This itself was not unusual. Enslaved people often sang while working, using music to maintain rhythm, mark time, find small moments of beauty in brutal labor. But these songs were different. They were the songs from Saint Domingue, the songs about gardens and children, about judges and justice, about birds flying home and waves returning to shore. The songs Adelaide had used to crack the certainty of New Orleans' elite families. 7 women sang them in perfect harmony. They sang while walking back to their quarters. They sang while preparing the evening meal. They sang with Adelaide's same deliberate precision, using the same minor keys. the same haunting melodies designed to unlock memory. And Victor Dumi, listening from his gallery, found himself thinking about his father, about the man who taught him to run a plantation, who'd explained that enslaved people were naturally suited to labor, that their suffering was exaggerated by northern agitators, that the system was economically necessary and morally justified. Dumas remembered being 8 years old, hiding behind a cotton bale, watching his father whip a man named Thomas for the crime of learning to read. He remembered how his father had wept that night in private, how Dumas had heard him through the bedroom wall saying to his mother, "God help me, what have I become?" He remembered his mother's response, "You are what this world requires you to be. Do not question it." And Dumas understood suddenly with terrible clarity that his father had known, had always known, had lived his entire life, knowing that what he did was wrong, had died with that knowledge, eating him from inside like disease, and had passed that same poisoned knowledge to his son. The next morning, Dumas rode to New Orleans and demanded to speak with Captain Marchand. "Where did they learn those songs?" Dumas asked, his voice shaking. "Where did my workers learn to sing like that?" Marchand's investigation moved quickly. Within days he'd identified 14 plantations within 30 miles of New Orleans, where enslaved women had suddenly begun singing the same distinctive songs. The pattern was identical at each location. 7 to 10 women singing in harmony using melodies and lyrics that produced profound psychological disturbance in white listeners. The connection became clear when Marchand interviewed the women. Each had been sold from various New Orleans households in recent months. Each had worked briefly alongside Celeste in the slave pens on Bond Street or Rampart Street in the brief periods between her sales, when she'd been held with other enslaved people awaiting new owners. In those holding pens, while dealers and buyers negotiated prices and white authorities paid no attention to what enslaved people did among themselves, Adelaide had been teaching. A woman named Sophie, who worked on the Dumas plantation, finally explained to Marchand what had happened. "She taught us the songs," Sophie said, speaking in the careful way enslaved people used when forced to testify to white authorities. Not just the melodies, but how to choose them, how to listen to white folks talk and learn their histories, how to remember the people they owned in Saint Domingue, the people they lost in the Revolution, the people they sold away or worked to death. She said the songs were weapons that looked like entertainment. She said we could use them the same way she did. "How many women did she teach?" Marchand asked. "As many as she could reach. 20, maybe 30. Some I never met. She said we should teach others if we got the chance. Said the song should spread like seeds on the wind, taking root wherever they landed." Marchand understood immediately what this meant. Adelaide hadn't been simply defending herself or seeking personal revenge. She'd been creating a movement, training other enslaved women to use the same psychological techniques she'd perfected, turning her individual act of resistance into something that could spread across plantations, multiply through networks of enslaved people, become impossible to stop. Judge Dufresne convened an emergency meeting when he learned this. The same men who decided Adelaide's fate gathered again, but now their panic was visible. They'd thought they were dealing with one anomalous individual. Instead, they faced something far more dangerous. "How do we stop songs?" Auguste Fourier asked, his voice tight with frustration. "How do we prohibit enslaved people from singing without admitting publicly why we're doing it?" "We can't," Jean-Claude Navarre said. "Any law against enslaved people singing would invite questions we cannot answer. The abolitionists in the North would use it as propaganda. They'd say, 'We're so fragile in our certainty that we fear mere music. It would make us look weak, frightened. But doing nothing allows this to spread," Duera countered. "Already 14 plantations report the same disturbances. How many more will we hear about next week, next month? How long before every plantation within 100 miles has women singing these cursed songs?" The meeting lasted 4 hours. What emerged was not a solution but a strategy of containment and erasure. They couldn't stop the songs without explaining why, but they could stop the story of how the songs spread. They could ensure that no official record existed of Adelaide's methods, her teaching, the systematic way she'd weaponized memory against slavery's psychological foundations. On August 23, Judge Dufresne issued a sealed order. All documents related to the case of the enslaved girl known as Celeste or Adelaide were were to be gathered and placed in restricted archives. Access would require judicial approval that Dufresne would personally deny to any requester. The order cited vague concerns about public morality and the protection of prominent families from malicious gossip. Captain Marchand's investigation notes were confiscated. The sale documents from de Saint-Baudot-Laval and Madame Corbeau were removed from public registries. Émile Gravois' written account of his conversation with Adelaide was seized from his apartment. Even the ship's manifest from the Providence Dawn was edited. The notation about the girl with unusual eye coloration carefully removed. The message to plantation owners was delivered through informal channels. Do not report disturbances related to singing. Do not discuss the matter publicly. Handle it privately, quietly, in whatever manner maintains order on your property, but create no documents that could be used by abolitionists as evidence of planters' psychological weakness. So, me plantations responded by forbidding enslaved women from singing entirely, a prohibition that was impossible to enforce and created more resentment than compliance. Others tried punishing women who sang the Saint Domingue songs, but punishment only made the songs spread faster as acts of defiance. A few plantation owners, those who'd been most affected by the songs, quietly began changing their practices, not abandoning slavery. They lacked the economic means and moral courage for that, but treating enslaved people with sly,